Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today in this special next installment in the Panasonic Veterans Business Impact Group Professional Development Guest Speaker Series. My name is Chérie Johnston, and I'm the president of the Veterans Business Impact Group for Panasonic North American companies now. Although I personally am not a United States veteran, I've been around the United States military for the past 29 years, originally through my marriage to a United States Marine in the early 90s, and moving forward as the CEO of a military support nonprofit the past 13 years, and finally as a community partner to the United States Army. I'd first like to take a moment to thank all of you and our Panasonic veteran employees who have served in the United States military. Also, to say thank you to those who have served their respective nations in foreign militaries around the globe. We'd like to formally recognize your service to your nation as well. The Veterans BIG objective is to bring our employees together through networking, mentorship, and community engagement while leveraging our own unique military experience and leadership skills to foster better collaboration within Panasonic's workforce. Further, to recognize our community of employee veterans alongside the family and friends of military veterans who support and encourage one another through shared experiences. By bringing together our unique background of military service, leadership, and dedication, we hope to capitalize on these strengths to better serve our companies, communities, and customers through veteran recruitment activities, career development, professional growth, and retention. If you're a United States veteran, please reach out to me directly to self-identify and become part of our official Panasonic veteran community. During the discussion, I'm going to place my email address in the chat. Also, please know that our organization is open to all employees, anyone interested in participating. You do not need to be a United States veteran. I personally, again, am not a veteran. Our Veterans BIG is going to have some exciting upcoming announcements, so please stay tuned in the near future for those. They will be coming out shortly. And following today's professional development event, our next guest speaker is going to be retired Marine Corps Sergeant Major Michael Mack, who previously ran the Wounded Warrior program for the Marine Corps. He's going to be speaking to us regarding leadership and mental health wellness. So we're really looking forward to that. Additionally, following in early 2023, Panasonic is going to be gifted with a special interview with U.S. Army retired General David Petraeus, which we're equally looking forward to now. So John Agoglia is a retired United States Army colonel who was one of the initial planners on 9/11, who immediately began planning the United States response to those attacks. We were trying to actually tie in his speaking engagement with the 9/11 anniversary today. These actions ultimately led to the invasions of both Afghanistan then Iraq. John was the director of the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute from 2004 to 2008, and he next directed the Counterinsurgency Training Center from Afghanistan in 2008 to 2010. I'm certain that there's so much more that John has done during his incredibly fascinating and exciting career, which we're going to delve into deeper today. So I'm not going to go too far into his introduction because we have a lot of questions for him. Also, I just personally want to take a moment to recognize that John was a support system to me daily throughout the several months that I was working to resettle some of our Afghan counterparts here in the United States. His tremendous experience and wisdom to my personal situation helped me to be successful in navigating my efforts. So I genuinely could not have survived those first weeks without his input and guidance. So I want to take a moment just to recognize that. So our discussion topic today is leading from behind. Today, we're going to be using a little bit different format than we normally do because instead of having John present directly, I'm going to actually ask him a lot of questions. We're going to dive right into different questions about his background. From there, I'm going to open it up to Q&A to all of you. So please begin putting your questions in now into the chat so that we have those ready. And after I finish my initial questions, we'll just dive right into your questions, okay? And I want to say thank you, John, so much for joining us today, and we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And we'll start with my very first question I have for you. So, of course, first, welcome. I'm really excited that you're here today. And my first question is, I have no idea, where are you from? you have an accent, so I know something East Coast, but where did you grow up?
So first off, thank you very much, Chérie, for inviting me to talk about leadership. Hopefully I can, give some thoughts, some pointers to folks. Hopefully I can answer some questions, because I think as a nation, we're in some trying times here, and leadership is important. I think leadership is something that doesn't go away. Even when you leave the military, you're still, I think, should be thinking about how you can continue to lead. And I think a lot of the veterans do. And those who are grown up around veterans, their families should be thinking about leadership. But everybody should be thinking about your civic responsibility to lead. And I hope we can touch on a bunch of those topics. But so thank you for this opportunity to talk. But to answer your question, where did I grow up? I grew up in a Italian mafia neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. While my name is Agoglia, I'm Irish Italian. I wasn't that Italian that was in the mafia, so I have a distaste for them significantly. But that's where I grew up, in a kind of a rough and tumble mafia neighborhood as a kid, and out of that grew a desire for me to go on, and I've just always wanted to serve in the Army, and since I was 8 years old, I wanted to serve in the Army, and I wanted to go to West Point and be an infantry officer, and I got to do exactly that. I got to go to West Point. I got to be an infantry officer, and I served for 31 years as an infantry officer. So I got to live my childhood dream, and serving in the military is what I always wanted to do, and it was a phenomenal experience. It was a privilege and an honor that America allowed me to do that by giving my education and sending me off to serve. So that's kind of my background of where I grew up.
So did you actually have someone in your family who influenced that decision and that dream, or was it just something that you were inspired because you had seen someone in the military?
I was just inspired by history. I read a lot of history as a young kid, and I was just inspired by that. And my father was a tech sergeant. I have a picture of my dad in June of 42 playing stickball on the street, graduating from high school, and then in October of 42 in full combat regalia, getting ready to deploy overseas. But in fact, my mom and my dad actually tried to talk me out of going to West Point. My brothers and sisters older than me, who my brother was drafted to go serve in Vietnam, and he never got there, but he was drafted. Well, he was deferred, so he was drafted, but he was deferred because of college. They were like, "Why do you want to go join the military?" So I had a family that was not committed to the military because they had seen the horrors of war in World War II. They had seen what had gone on in Vietnam, and they were not excited that I wanted to choose the military as a career. But they accepted it, but never fully supported it until after I graduated and a couple of years on in.
Then you were in. Okay, and I'm sorry, what year did you graduate from West Point?
1980.
1980. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. And so I want you to walk me through the pathway of like your career pathway. So you were infantry, or, where did your career start? And just kind of walk us through the moves. 31 years is a very long career in the United States Army. So, where from the 1980 forward, where were you stationed? What were you doing? Just kind of give us that high level overview of it.
Sure. Early 80s, go to the first thing, I was assigned to compassionate reassignment near home, because I found out the day I graduated that my dad had terminal cancer. He kept that from us and told us how he just had cancer. He was okay. But in fact, I found out he had terminal cancer, and it was the day after graduating. I went to see the doctor with him and found out he was going to pass away in 4 weeks. So I had a compassionate reassignment to deal with my dad and my family situation. And the compassionate reassignment, they put me in charge of the burial platoon. So I was out there doing burials of other folks while at home nursing my dad, who was going to pass away in 4 weeks. They finally figured out that probably wasn't a good idea.
Not a good idea.
Yeah, not the best of ideas. So, but I served at Fort Hamilton, New York, as my first assignment on a compassionate dealing with my dad. I finally got through that. He passed away in August. And by October, I was at the basic course, went to Ranger School, showed up on my first unit in May of 81 as an infantry platoon leader in a battalion. And again, learned a lot about leadership in a unit that was completely screwed up. I was probably in one of the worst infantry units in the United States Army. And I say that because they relieved the battalion commander, the battalion sergeant major, the battalion XO, the Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie company commanders, the S1, the S2, and the S3. So anybody knows an Army battalion, that's like most of the leadership. So I got to go from being a lieutenant to being an S4, served in that. We did the second rotation at the National Training Center, instrumented rotation back in '82. Spent 5 years. I got to command early at Fort Stewart, Georgia. Left Fort Stewart, went to the advanced course, the Armor Advanced course. Had an opportunity to go get a chemical engineering degree at Vanderbilt and go back and teach at West Point, but an opportunity popped up to go and be an OC at the National Training Center, and I decided that's what I wanted to do, was be an OC. And I remember calling up Branch, and the guy in Branch said nobody turns down getting a chemical engineering degree and teaching at West Point to be an OC. And I said,
okay,
well,
wait, stop for a moment. So we've got some civilians here. So explain to us what an OC is.
An observer controller, where we observe and assess how units train out in the desert. How prepared are they for combat? So,
okay. Are
you ready for your combat mission? And so the branch officer said, no one turns down a chemical engineering degree to do that. And I said, well, I guess he just meant nobody. He hung up on me, but I got the assignment, so it was fantastic. I then went from that assignment to being an instructor at our career course, our captain's career course, and had a blast doing that. And then from there, I got to be a company commander for a infantry officer basic course, where we teach the new lieutenants how to become infantry officers. And then from there, I went to what's called Command and General Staff School, and I went to a school called SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies, which was a course. Folks in the Army know about it. They call us the Jedi Knights. We're supposed to be strategic planners. From there, I went to Korea and was part of the planning for, war plans in Korea. About the time that Saddam made his second move towards the Kuwait border back in the mid-90s, about the time that the Korean Peninsula almost went to war over the nuclear incident when President Clinton was president. So it was a pretty trying year in Korea. From there, I went to Fort Irwin, went back to Fort Stewart to be a Brigade 3. And from there, I went out to Joint Task Force 6 in the desert to work counter-drug missions and work with civil-military relations and running counter-drug missions and dealing with counter-drug issues for 3 years. And then from there, I was sent to Japan to be a war planner. And then from Japan, I was sent to Central Command in Tampa, Florida. I got there 6 weeks before 9/11, and I was like, okay, great. This is going to be a really nice, fun family assignment. Little did I know that I actually know Baghdad and Kabul better than I know Tampa. Just saying.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time deployed.
Who would have thought, right, when you were heading to thinking
exactly.
Florida? Beautiful assignment. Right. Yeah. Wow.
So that's kind of my early background.
Wow, that's incredible. So number one, I didn't know that you had gone through the Ranger School. That was fascinating. And I feel like just tying in the leadership component of it, the fact that you had, where you were talking about just the turnover in the executive leadership, it's unfortunate that happened, but it's almost a good thing, because it set the stage for giving you that experience of, what not to do. And this is how things can go terribly south and go bad, right?
Right.
And give you that good example
and I often say that
early on.
Folks bemoan bad situations, and I said, well, you can learn from bad situations, because you can learn what not to do. You can make a choice as a leader what to do and what not to do, and sometimes you don't know what not to do unless you've seen what bad really looks like. It's good to see what good looks like, but it's also good to see what bad looks like and understand the two and figure out how you can navigate between those two parameters: what good is, what bad is, and why. So yeah, it's you can learn from any experience, even a bad experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lesson to be learned there. So I'm glad you brought that up. So with the 9/11, okay. So you're still, when 9/11 happens, you're still in uniform, or you are? Okay.
I'm at 21 years.
You're at 21 years. So you still haven't retired. Okay. So walk us through that. You're at CENTCOM, 9/11 happens, and how has your role now changed?
Well, CENTCOM was an organizational headquarters of about 1,500 people on 9/11. When by the afternoon of 9/11, we had received a top secret planning order to begin planning combat operations against 5 nations. Think about that. What's the threat? Everybody talks, and you learn these military strategy that the command authority comes down with a national mission, and they come down and lay out what the threat is, and they give you this tremendous guidance. Hey, we didn't get any of that. It was pure fear, because we had just been struck pretty hard, and we didn't know when we were going to get struck again, by whom. We started figuring it out, and within 72 hours, we kind of had an idea of exactly what had happened finally. But from that, how to respond. And as a nation, we weren't sure. and unfortunately fell on the shoulders of our planning team to kind of start shaping that, what that looked like, and handing that off to the CENTCOM commander, General Franks, to bring up to the Secretary of Defense and the President what our options were. And based on our analysis is how the global war on terror got launched, because we're like, okay, we can't just fight this from the Afghanistan piece. We have to look at this from a broader perspective. This enemy threat that we face is a networked enemy. It's like the internet. So if you go after one node of this terrorist threat, they're going to find other means to come around and still stay as a viable force. And we're seeing that for years as we see that. So how do we apply pressure to as many nodes as possible to diminish their capability and break their capability in certain places? And that's what led to the global war on terror. And with that, we did the planning for Afghanistan, and people said, oh, the plan for Afghanistan went really well. And what I tell you is that we actually were winging it the entire time. We were driven to going fast and furious and getting things put in. If you think about it, we had the initial combat operations in the middle of October, which is about 30 plus days after the initial strikes against us. And did we know what the outcome was going to be? No. Were we confident we were going to achieve some success in some places? Yes and no. And as we achieved success, we kept on then, what's the next branch sequel? And it was a very dynamic process. That was pretty straining, pretty strenuous. Sleep was a rare thing. We hardly were home for that time frame, working and just continuously developing the plan as events on the ground unfolded. And they unfolded very rapidly. Yeah. Good friend of mine, Joe Votel, he jumped in on the 19th into Mullah Omar's as the Ranger Regimental Commander. Who would have thought that Joe jumping on in, he's soon to be the SOCOM commander 20 years later, still dealing with the same threat, the same fight. We never saw that happening. But from there, we moved to the Iraq planning, and that just continued into the war in Iraq. And it was just a nonstop planning piece against those two threats. And bringing in all the different nations and building the partnerships and the coalition with the different nations and the different militaries. It was a real challenge working through that.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. And the piece of trying to get everybody, and that again ties back into that leadership of trying to get everybody on the same page going forward. And I think I've asked multiple of our guests that, is I'm still trying to figure out the secret sauce there. Here at Panasonic, we work for a truly global company. So you've got 100 different cultures, 100 different, ultimately languages, you've got time zones, so how do you get everybody moving on the same page, on the same mission? We seem to do it fantastically here at Panasonic, but I'm still trying to understand the secret sauce underlying that, that gets everybody going in the same direction. And I think it ties down to leadership, but still trying to get to the heart of that.
Leadership is a key piece, but more importantly, it's humility, empathy, and the ability to listen. And I think that was a point that Lieutenant General Mike Howard made to you guys the last time when he spoke at the last series you had. And the key was, here we are as a force putting together a plan both for Iraq and Afghanistan, and different nations want to join the coalition. Well, the challenge is you have to understand what they bring to the table. You have to understand what the national interest is, and you have to understand that they're coming. And the initial guy you're talking to, while he may just be a lieutenant colonel, or a major, depending on the rank structure and the size of the force, might be a 1-star or 2-star general. He's going directly back to the Minister of Defense to have a discussion with him as to why they should support this American effort. And all the Americans are willing to take into account their national interest and what their objectives are. And sometimes they're the same, but sometimes they're slightly different. So that first meeting with them means you have to open up the plan again for a complete relook by a new group coming on in. And you have to be conscious that that's what they want to know. They want to walk away from that discussion knowing that you listened, you're willing to work with them, you're willing to consider, not everything, but you're willing to consider their point of view, and you see them as equals, not as an inferior partner. And if you can't accomplish that, they're going back to the Minister of Defense and say, let's not play. Now, if they go back to the Minister of Defense and let's not play, that Minister of Defense is going to go to their head of state, and that head of state is going to come to the president, and the president is going to come down to the SecDef and Tommy Franks and say, hey, what the hell's going on here? You guys didn't accommodate these folks. Yeah. So you only got to screw that up once to realize, there's a problem. And so again, it's the ability to go in and listen. It's the humility. It's the empathy. It's the understanding of what they're doing and the willingness to listen to another set of ideas and a different perspective, but pull that together in a holistic fashion. And that to me is a little bit of the leadership from behind, because they have to feel like they're in charge of their interests and of their forces, and they have insight or input into the plan on how they're going to be used to accomplish their objectives, even if they're the same as ours. They have to feel that, and you have to give that to them. But make sure you do so in a way that knits together the chain of command at the operational level that's effective.
Yeah, so it has to be a win-win, and it has
Yeah.
to be, there's got to be that ownership component that they feel that
Right.
they feel there's ownership into
Right.
the decision-making process. Excellent. Okay, so when you are moving past this, did you go to Iraq or did you go to Afghanistan first?
Went to Iraq first. I did not go
Okay.
to Afghanistan right away. Afghanistan, we were doing the initial Afghanistan planning. The bond, we were in Thanksgiving. The bond agreement was getting pulled together. We had just taken Bagram and Kabul, and they're doing the bond agreement. And on the Friday after Thanksgiving of 2001 is when we got the initial exploratory review of looking at an invasion of Iraq. And so we got moved to that piece in a very closed compartment. Planning team was put together to focus on the Iraq planning. We started that initial discussion with the SecDef on the, like I said, the Friday after Thanksgiving, and we had initial concepts getting briefed to the president by the 19th of December.
Okay, so at that point, you're still in Florida, but you're going to physically now go to Iraq, correct?
We didn't physically deploy to Iraq. Well, not to Iraq, but we started the initial planning there in, as I said, in November of 01. But we got the full-blown approval from the National Command Authority to continue pursuing developing a plan for Iraq in January. And we then January of 02. And so for all of 02, we put together the planning effort for Iraq, and we went into moving the CENTCOM headquarters forward to Qatar, and we moved forward in September, October of 2002, and then did the final preparations and did the launch into the Iraq War in March of 03.
So as that moves forward, you're still in the military at this point. So as you go into the Iraq War, what was your role there? You know, what were your responsibilities? What was your involvement?
So the first part of it, again, was still continuing the planning, building the alliance, make sure the plan was solid, looking at the, the operational plan, making sure that we synchronized that with our allies, with the different components, the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and getting that solid, getting approval by the president for the war game, for the final military operation. But then the next part was looking and putting together the post-conflict planning effort, putting that together. And then I was sent out to be the LNO to what was called the ORHAD, Jay Garner, who was going to be put in as a civil authority in the Iraq conflict, and that changed over to Ambassador Bremer, and I was the LNO to Ambassador Bremer and to Jay Garner, then Ambassador Bremer, up in Baghdad from from May of 03 until June of 04. So up there working in the civ mil planning, working on the reconstruction planning, the stabilization planning, trying to get that straight for Iraq.
Oh, okay. That's fascinating. I actually was able to meet Ambassador Bremer when I was interning for Congressman Royce, and that would have been in 05. So yeah, right after that time period. It's kind of interesting. He was back here in the US with us. Okay, so that's interesting. So how long do you estimate that you were there in Iraq, spending time overseas?
Between Qatar and Iraq, I was pretty much gone from September of 02 until June of 04. I came back a couple of times, but pretty much during that time frame is when I was gone over there.
A long time.
Yeah. And prior to that, I was on the road nonstop from pretty much February of 02 until September of 02. Yeah. I'm sure. So from February of 02 to September of 02, I was pretty much back and forth in and out of the theater doing the exercises from September of 02 until June of 04. I was pretty much over there. Yeah.
So as you move over into Afghanistan, how specifically did your responsibilities and your role change? Like what led over to you switching nations?
So
and you're still in uniform, correct?
Right. So when I left Iraq in June of 04, I was assigned to stand up the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute and to focus on stability planning and U.S. government, whole of government planning, because we needed work there. We weren't as strong as a nation as we needed to be, but also coalition whole of government planning and working with the allies. So I was tasked with putting together the doctrine, putting together proposals, and building a coalition of U.S. government organizations and the military working together, which is, when you're talking about working with state and aid and other departments and the NGOs on stability planning, they look at you as the 21st century Neanderthal and, knuckle dragging Neanderthal. And they're like, why would I want to work with you? So change those attitudes and getting them to want to work with us and seeing that there was benefit, because that space called that stability, when the war ends or the major fighting ends, and to the point where you're at a stable, peaceful nation, there's that gray area that no one seems to be in charge of. And so we had a problem. So my job was to work on putting that together. I did that for 4 years. I took an organization that had 6 people when I got there, and I built it to 45. And I found out that General McKiernan, who I had known, was going over to take over Afghanistan. I was at year 28, and I could have retired, easily could have retired. And I just, in my heart of hearts, I couldn't do it, because I knew we were sending all these captains and these sergeants and these soldiers over for multiple tours. And I had spent 2.5, almost 3 years deployed doing the Iraq piece, but I just had 4 years where I wasn't deployed. And I was on the road an awful lot, but I wasn't deployed. And I just couldn't retire without having deployed, because I just felt
so
that would.
You were stateside in between. Okay.
Yeah, I was stateside for those 4 years.
Okay.
I was traveling. Now, again, I was supposedly assigned to
as the military does.
To Carlisle, but I was on the road for about 230 days a year for 4 years straight. So then I got asked by McKiernan to come over and stand up the counter. Two jobs: either be the stability advisor to President Karzai, or to run the counterinsurgency training center. And it was a great conversation. General McKiernan looked at me and said, "Hey, you're in this room because I trust you. I assume you trust me." He said, and I heard you're interested in going back to the fight. I said, yes, and I'd like to work for you. So he brought me on over. He gave me running the counterinsurgency training center, and I ran that for 2.5 years in Afghanistan, and actually got a mandatory retirement date extension, because they wanted me to stay longer. So I spent 2.5 straight years. That's how I ended my career as running the counterinsurgency training center in Afghanistan.
Okay, so with the counterinsurgency training center and standing, because I understood you stood that up. Just walk us through that. Like, what was that? What was involved? How did you build that up? How did you know how to build that up? Because I understand, and looking in our last guest's background a little bit too, that this concept of counterinsurgency at this point to the United States Army was new. This was not something, correct, that you guys had studied for years, or this was something that was evolving as you were in Afghanistan?
It was something that we as a military had not put on the back burner after Vietnam, and it took us a while to get back into it. By 2008, we were much better evolved from the doctrinal point of view, but the training piece, how to operationalize the doctrine, how to train our forces to be prepared to deal. What's important in a counterinsurgency versus a force-on-force fight? What isn't? How do you transfer relationships? I mean, one of the key things in counterinsurgency is, hey, you establish a relationship with a tribal elder or with some other Afghan official. How do you transfer that relationship to the guy who comes in and replaces you? That's a challenge to figure that out. And so those are things we had to focus in on. What does a relief in place look like? A relief in place under combat conditions is very different than a relief in place when you're doing a stability/counterinsurgency operation. And that was the other part, is a lot of NATO nations saw stability as the primary focus and weren't thinking of the fighting portion of a counterinsurgency, because they thought stability wasn't fighting. They thought it was more peacekeeping. So the whole idea of the counterinsurgency training center was to get the NATO team on side and the ISAF team on side to understand that there was a significant fight still to be had here, different than what the initial fight was, and different than the fight in Iraq, and how we had to do that. And yes, we're trying to stabilize, but that means there's fighting. It's more fighting than peacekeeping. It's a combination of those, and getting people to understand that. And then again, pulling into that whole of government work that I've been doing previously at the Peacekeeping Institute, bringing in the NGOs, bringing in the contractors, bringing in all the other nations, getting instructors from the different nations, getting Afghan instructors, working with all of the USG civilians who will come on, and the US government civilians, working with those NGOs as well, and also the NATO civilians and the other country civilians. And that's what we were trying to build, so we had a more holistic perspective on how to put a strategy together for dealing with the counterinsurgency.
Yeah, and you touched on something I thought was super interesting in the beginning of that, was just the fact that you were saying, like, you build a relationship, right? So you're in a remote area of Afghanistan and you've built a relationship and a rapport, and you do switch commanders. And then the trust is gone, right? That
Right.
rapport is instantly gone. So it's like building that all over again. I imagine that would be starting like from scratch. So would that be you're extending the time of those commanders to stay there longer to continue those relationships, or how did that work out? How do you work around complex instances like that?
So one of the challenges we talked about, I would often ask folks, think about what you experienced in your first 90 days on the ground. Now think about what you told your guy who's replacing you about how you were handling the situation. I said, did you take the time to explain to him the first 90 days of confusion, challenges that you dealt with? Or did you talk to him about where you are now as if it was steady state and was always there, and therefore failed to pass on all those experiences you had and went, oh, damn. Yeah, I said, so I would challenge the leaders to keep a journal. If they can keep a journal the first 90 days and pull that out and use that as the means to guide their handoff of their relationships and of their sector to the other commanders, because it was those personal experiences and those challenges that they faced, one with developing the relationships with what the situation on the ground was, to understanding it and dealing with their lack of knowledge, that they needed to realize that these guys coming in were in that boat. And what they needed to do is pass on those experiences of those 90 days to help them get through that quicker, because they're still going to go through it, but let them know that they weren't the first ones to ever go through this. And therefore it's normal to go through this, but explain that. But we tend to forget. We want to talk about where we are and how good we've been without talking about how hard it was to get there in the first place. And they're like, wow. And when we started doing that, we started seeing some results. But when we didn't, we saw really bad results, because it just was force of personality that would achieve an effective handover, not because we had a routine process in place to make sure that we achieved an effective handover of those relationships.
I think that what you're saying is so fascinating, because it could absolutely be transitioned over to the corporate world, correct?
Yes.
You know, if you think about it, because we have leadership changes and some of those at high levels as well, you know, and it's like you're walking in and there's that incredible learning curve, because you're trying to rapidly absorb new information while you're trying to keep the consistency of your team and you're trying to juggle multiple things. So that's really actually fascinating advice. And I wonder if that could be said to executives, you should be journaling, you know, and start keeping those notes just for transition, right?
Yeah, and as someone once said, is that whenever a problem occurs, and it's somebody else's fault, or whenever a problem occurs that's outside of you, and you look at it and you blame it on an individual. Whenever you're in the middle and a problem occurs, you blame it on external circumstances. You know what I mean? So you got to get that lens and realize that, hey, wait a second, stop. You're a part of the issue. Either you're a part of the problem, you're not a part of the problem, but you can't blame somebody else for what's happening that's bad, and not accept blame when you might be the cause of something being bad. So you have to figure out, how do we share and talk with one another and get each other to understand what is happening. And again, I think that's the art of leadership, is knowing that as you look and you see different organizational changes, you have to realize that that relationship I have with Chérie is going to change, because she left. Now comes in Bob. Okay, well, Bob sees the world very differently than Chérie. But how do I transition the relationship between Chérie and my, you know, and my subordinate that I know is critical to Bob and my subordinate? And as leaders, you have to be thinking about that. You can't just assume it's going to happen. And when you do, that's when you start seeing cracks in your structure, and you're not building a learning organization. You're building an organization that's very hierarchical, and it's not a learning organization in which you have to find a way and know what's going on and continue to pass on those relationships. And I think that's a difference between a learning organization and an organization that isn't a learning organization, is their focus on their transition of those relationships. Any organization, even a corporate organization.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful. I'm glad you shared that. So with Afghanistan, with this counterinsurgency role, you were over there for how many years before you came home?
2.5.
2.5. Okay. So that's quite a long foreign assignment in a very intense, austere environment. So you're in Kabul during that time and you're in uniform. So is this leading you towards your retirement, or where are you at now in your career?
Yeah, I retired after that. I retired in January of 11, and now I do consulting work. I work for a small company that provided the trainers for the military going overseas. Did that for a couple of years, helped grow that company from a $7 million to a $30 million company, or $26 million company. And then I went and formed my own company, and now I do consulting. Right now I do strategic level policy and strategy global exercises for the Office of Secretary of Defense. I'm contracted through Booz Allen, through the National Defense University, and I do those exercises, and it's a blast because I'm a mile wide and about an inch deep on a whole ton of topics. But the thing that links it together is this idea of leadership, this idea of thinking, this idea of setting a strategy and putting a plan in place. But how do you do that is by getting everybody in the room, as big an audience as you can, to work through and identify who has an interest in this problem set and make sure everybody's voices are heard, and then coming up with a more holistic solution set. So to me, it's just a natural extension of what I was doing as a strategic planner in the military.
Yeah, it seems like you really continued the skill set that you were able to hone through the military. And it's funny to just see full circle now that I've been able to kind of, and I don't want to use the word interrogate, but ask you all these questions about your career. It's like, so from the beginning, I didn't know you had gone, through the Ranger training where you started to just becoming this high-level strategic planner. It's fascinating. And it's fascinating to see where your career evolved, but also where your interest seems to have stayed. And you seem to be gifted and talented in that area, that you were able to take on some of these higher level positions to do that. That's really, really amazing. Okay, so heading into last year, so you've done all of this amazing work, and during these conflicts that we've had in the Middle East and with the United States. And then last year, and we won't touch on this for too long, but I did want to touch on it briefly, that so we have the fall of Kabul last summer. We all saw it on CNN, Fox, BBC, we were all watching it. And so you have actually been heavily involved with that, as I touched on in the very beginning. So you've been instrumental in helping to resettle a lot of the Afghan population into the United States. And not just initially, but the longer term. Here we are sitting here over a year later, and you're still heavily involved. You're involved with a nonprofit. I believe you sit on the board of directors. So could you just speak to that? And you had a conference in Washington, D.C. recently. You're working on some legislation. So I'll let you speak to that.
For a lot of us who served in a place like Afghanistan and Iraq, we were always engaged in trying to get out our folks who had served with us. And so prior to the collapse of Afghanistan, I'd helped get out about 16 families already. These were guys who had worked as interpreters for us and combat interpreters and worked with us in Afghanistan, and now had threats against them, and helped get them out and help get their family out because of threats against their family, and watched as every one of those guys and gals became productive U.S. citizens. They came here, they worked, they completed their education, they got jobs, they got their citizenship, they brought more of their family over, helped with that. So when you're seeing the collapse and you get in the call and you still have 3 or 4 folks that you want to get out, and that to me was heartbreaking. So I jumped in to help the evac organizations, and I'm no specialty in evacuation, but I know the guys started Scott Mann, Task Force Pineapple, the guys that did Dunkirk and all these other organizations. So I worked with them to help get my folks on out. But I realized the evac space was short-lived, pretty packed. And I started looking in October going, well, how are we doing on the resettlement? Because there were some real challenges there. So that's where I decided to focus my energy. So I helped, got pulled into an organization and helped set it on up called the Afghan Refugee Crisis Committee. It's an organization of 9 Afghan, Muslim, and veteran organizations. And we were asked how could we help the resettlement agencies who were overwhelmed to deal with the Afghan resettlement. So we came up with an idea of providing Afghan individuals to work as assistants to the case managers, so we call them case aides, to help them so they had the cultural awareness, the cultural understanding, they had the empathy for the folks coming out, as well as the vets who had the understanding of trauma, to help these folks get resettled and help these organizations provide the services they need to these refugees, soon to be, as I say, these Afghan refugees, soon to be our fellow Americans. So we were able to do that. And then we stood up an organization called Global Friends of Afghanistan with a friend of mine, Jason Hoke, and I'm the deputy director of that. And our focus there was, hey, we want to continue supporting evacuation. We want to focus on resettlement, and we also want to provide a space for young Afghans who've been there for 20 years, who saw their nation taken away from them by the Haqqani Taliban terrorist network, provide them a space where they can discuss what does the future government of Afghanistan look like when this terrorist regime is put out. It's going to get thrown out. It's at what cost, that I don't know, but it's going to go away. So let's make sure we have these Afghans talking about what governance looks like so we don't make the same mistakes we made with the corruption that just riddled that government and the warlords, and get those peaks and use those folks who for 20 years were developed under international tutelage, and they understand what right looks like. Give them the opportunity to shape what the future government looks like, but give them that space to have that discussion. So that's the work I'm doing right now.
That's excellent. Yeah, it's so wonderful that you're doing that. And I know it's definitely also coming from a place of absolute kindness and compassion, just knowing you. So just really full circle tying that all in. So now that we've heard and learned about your incredible career, and I promise everyone this is my final question because we've already got a few questions in the chat. And please, everybody, go ahead and put your questions in there now. Full circle with this concept of leading from behind. And we've called our guest speaker series today, this event that. Can you explain this concept to all of us so that we understand it? And I'm really excited about this because I'd never heard this before. I didn't know it was a thing. You and I had this conversation, and I know that our vice president and he's a retired Army colonel as well, Colonel Escola, and we talked about it, and he said, well, yeah, that's in. And so I'm just really excited to share this with everyone at Panasonic now.
So the concept of leading from behind, and you heard this from the previous guy, and again, I'll go back, because I know Mike Howard pretty well, served with him in Afghanistan. He talked about the need where when you're a coalition, when you're working with a coalition, there's nobody who is in charge. You have what's kind of a coordination authority. And in order to be a coordinating authority, you have to find a way to collaborate effectively. And sometimes the best way to collaborate effectively is by providing people the space to have a discussion and to share their views, and again, feel valued, feel like their opinions are valued, feel like their goals and objectives are understood, and to feel like you understand them and are willing to work with them, even when your goals and objectives might be slightly different, or the part of the puzzle that you have to solve is different, but the pieces are interconnected. So, how do we work diplomatically in standing up a political team while simultaneously ensuring that the security forces are the type of security forces that are supportive of civilian control of a military or of the security force? How do we do the development in a way that isn't partisan, and in an area where partisan activities have been a cause, or tribalism has been a cause for fractures in the unity? So again, you have to understand how you can be a part of that discussion, how you can lead by listening and having the empathy, but also by laying out some key pieces and parts and getting people to realize that what they're asking for is unrealistic, that they need to do a better job of listening to others, that they need to do a better job of understanding that even though we don't see things the same, it doesn't mean that other person is wrong. And if you're the person in the room who's always saying, listen to me, you can't be that person who leads from behind by being that person who demonstrates how to listen, how to get people to collaborate, how to get people to talk together, and how to get people to share their willingness or share their views of what needs to be done, and then create the willingness to work together. And if you're not that person behind the scenes formulating that, if you're the person out there taking credit for, oh, I did this, you're not going to be able to do that. So I call it leading from behind. And it's critical working with the U.S. government. We have the United States Aid for International Development. You have the Department of State. You have the Department of Treasury. You have the Department of Justice. Hey, those are all organizations of their own that have very important missions to do in a operation of counterinsurgency or stability, or in real war, in a regular full armed conflict. Their views are critical to the development of a strategic approach that is achieving the United States government goals. You can't just be in there talking about the United States military goals, because to me, there's no such thing as the United States military goal. There's the United States government goal. And so you may be the biggest actor in terms of the most resources and the most force, but you need to be the humblest and willing to listen and make sure you understand and appreciate and respect what they bring to the table and respect what they can do for you. And that is, to me, is leading from behind. It's by being able to generate that respect and show them at the same time by kind of guiding as best you can this discussion in a way that gets us to a solution that may not be the one you would have thought of, but turns out to be the best solution set.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a little bit of providing empowerment to others. Yes. and seeing where that goes. And so really being part of a team and just kind of, giving people the tools. and the resources, right?
And that approach applies. It applies to business. It applies to anything you're doing where you have to do a collaborative effort and work together, because it's about building a team and building the respect among the players in the team and working together truly as a team. You can't tell somebody, I'm willing to be a leader and I'm willing to listen and take critiques or criticism, and then when you take it, shoot them down, chew them apart, not listen. You have to demonstrate that willingness to listen, to learn, and to be disagreed with. And that's, for a lot of folks, it's very hard. Your senior officers, it's hard. And that was my role when I was a planner, was I was a guy who disagreed with the senior officers. Now, I tell you, a lot of time it wasn't fun, but that was my job, because you said you wanted me to disagree with you. By God, I'm going to do it. And you had guys who didn't like that, and eventually they got to like it because you saw a better result. But it was painful in the process. So you also have to understand what your role is in that process, and how do you fit that role? And it's going to change based on where you are in the organization.
Yeah, I think that it's just, it's a fascinating concept. And I think people have to really, really vest into it, because there's always ego involved, right? And be able to put that aside and step back from, and the sensibilities, and just kind of step back and think, okay, we're trying to get to the end objective. And it's not about me personally. It's about how do we best reach that objective, right?
As I say to people, when I walk in the room, there's one thing that helps me tremendously. It's because I know I'm not the smartest person in the room. And I say that. I know that. I know I am not the smartest person. And I know my view isn't the only view that's in the room. And I know there are other views out there worth listening to. So I have learned that. I have seen that. It spans whether, diversity, again, people talk about diversity. I'm like, how can you not have diversity? Why is there, we're going to have women in this discussion? Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you have a woman in here? I mean, women think differently than men, which is awesome. And if women didn't, got to be a boring freaking world. You know what I mean? Different cultures think differently. It's bringing as much diversity as you can into the discussion. You'll be shocked at what you'll learn. You'll be shocked at what they bring to the table, and that willingness to listen and learn. You're going to learn. You're going to realize that you have inherent biases that you don't even know are there. And when you start listening to people talking, going, well, I got that problem. Geez, I guess hey, I need to learn. And you grow by engaging others with diverse views, because you realize, wow, my view of the world was slightly colored through the wrong set of glasses here. And now I got a broader view. And that helps you be a better leader.
Yeah, it was narrow. It was, and then it's growing. Yeah, that's excellent. I absolutely love that. I love that idea too, because my MBA is international business, so I'm definitely a fan of the world. So it's all excellent. Okay, so I'm going to dive in because we've got 5 questions. So I want to make sure we give these just a few more minutes to get through them. So on September 11th, 2001, the United States was attacked by terrorists, but I've always wondered why it took a year and 7 months, March 20, 2003, to respond. Why was Iraq chosen as the enemy state instead of Saudi Arabia, which was most of the terrorists were from Saudi nationalists?
First part is we responded in less than 30 days, not a year and a half. And the country where the attacks emanated from was from Osama bin Laden and the AQ network in Iraq, where the terrorists had grown. So we were in there in 30 days. And we dealt with that threat. And the Taliban was given a choice. The Taliban was given a choice of turn over bin Laden and we will come in and invade you. Or, if you don't, we're going to come in and we're going to invade you and we're going to take you apart as well, which we did. We didn't do a good job of capitalizing upon that once we defeated the AQ network in Saudi Arabia. In Afghanistan. But from a Saudi point of view, the Saudis actually worked very closely with us to go after the AQ network in Saudi and helped us identify other places, transition points, ways of funneling money. So they very much joined the effort to help us combat the terrorist threat that was coming from the AQ network, even though bin Laden was a Saudi Arabian who had started this network. He was disenfranchised by their government. They were not supporters of it. So again, we didn't see Saudi as a target.
They were more of a strategic partner, correct?
Yeah.
In the war.
And Iraq was that's a long discussion why we went to Iraq. But again, we didn't go after Saudi because Saudi was actually partnering with us. And while many of the terrorists were Saudis, it was actually the AQ network that was based in Afghanistan that was the threat.
And we did additionally have military bases already existing in Saudi Arabia, correct?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so next question. How can a company like Panasonic foster a culture where all employees feel ownership in the decision-making process and direction of the company? So I would think, the full company moving forward.
So what I often tell people is if you wait for your boss to implement this idea of leading from behind, if you wait for somebody from above to do it, you're missing the opportunity. Be in charge of your kingdom. You start it. And so hopefully it's a top down and a bottom up approach. I always told my people, I'm in charge of my little kingdom. I don't care what's happening outside. What I care about is how we do it in here. And then how we do our things within our team will permeate out into others and it will help. But even if it doesn't, at least in our team, we're doing the best we can to be the best that we can in terms of building a team. So first, it starts with you. What can you do to be a better team player, a better team leader, a member of that team? How can you be? So one of the things I tell individuals, Covey has a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and he talks about dependence, independence, and interdependence. So what are you doing to get yourself on the path from dependence, where you depend upon everybody, independence, where you think, you've done everything, you realize now you haven't. And that's where most of us get to interdependence, where you realize you're dependent upon the team around you. How can you as an individual become a better team member? So that's step one. Then two, once you become a better team member, how can you help others see the utility of being part of the team? That to me is the first best step, is you. Don't look for someone else to do it for you. If you do, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But once you start doing it, then you can start pushing up the chain and asking them to do that, and they can. And you can talk to them about, here are the things and the effectiveness that you're having as a team, and showing the results that you're achieving by being a team member, by being somebody who listens and is interdependent upon others, and by being that person. In military organizations, I would forbid my folks from walking in talking bad about the headquarters above them or the headquarters below them. And I would challenge them to find a way to make the headquarters above you respect what you're doing and want to talk to you, and find a way to find the guys below you to see you as an asset, not as a liability. That's on you. How do you interact with the up and down so that they see you as an asset? And then your little piece, build your team. So that's what happens. When you start doing that, then you have the ability to start talking to others about how to do team building. And you can start making requests of higher up to, hey, you can help us here. Bring them into the process. Let them see. You change it one person at a time. That's how it happens. And your leader can try to change that, but then he has to take time, one person at a time, pushing this down through the chain while you're pushing it on up. So own it yourself as well as looking for the company to do it. That's step one. That would be my advice.
That is such excellent advice, though, John, because I've thought of that before in situations where you've been in a work situation and it might be frustrating or something, and you come to the conclusion, I can't control things outside your control. You just flat out can't. So you have to learn, and not necessarily accept them, but you can control yourself. You can control your own performance. You can control what a good job, and kind of redirect that energy and focus to yourself. And I'm going to work really hard on my own performance and deliver time and time again good results, and then the rest of it'll sort itself out, right?
Yeah, and in a lot of the disagreement I see in America today, it's everybody's a victim. Well, you're a victim. Why? Are you really a victim? I mean, look at what you got. I mean, I've been to countries where if people had what we had, oh my God, they'd be so happy. And I see people who have it and they're victimized. I'm like, how are you victimized? Well, I can't get a job because of this group. Well, no, you got a job. I mean, let's say quit being a victim and start being somebody who takes control of your life, of your area, of your neighborhood, of your family, and make yourself and those around you better by enabling them and being somebody who listens about how can we help and improve, rather than talking about how you've been victimized. And I think it's just a simple way to do things.
So this is actually not a question, it's a comment, but it says, no question, awesome conversation, which has been liked multiple times. So I'm just going to read that one out. Okay. I remember President Bush declaring war in Iraq, publicly national TV, but I do not remember war being declared against Afghanistan. Was Afghanistan initially a conflict like Kosovo?
That's a good question. Look, we said we're going to war in Afghanistan. I'm in the middle of it, planning it. But did he tell the nation we're going to war in Afghanistan? No, he didn't, quite honestly. I think he announced it after the fact. I think he announced after the fact because we did it as when we were coming. We told the Taliban we were going to come after them if they didn't turn over bin Laden, but we didn't tell them the timing. We didn't tell them how. And I don't think we announced it till after the fact. And we said, okay, now we're going after them. I think at that point we announced it. And I think the War Powers Act was passed by Congress that gave the president the authority to do so. So I believe it was through the War Powers Act of 2001. That post 9/11 that gave the president the authority, as I understand. I could be wrong, a little rusty on that, to go into Afghanistan.
It's a while ago.
Yeah, and we really never really got a formal declaration of war in Iraq either. It was through the War Powers Act and the UN resolution that we went to the UN and got the UN resolution, and in support of the UN resolution, we went into war in Iraq. So again, we never formally declared war in either one of those, but we used the War Powers resolution as the means by which the president was given authority by Congress to wage conflict against those two nations.
Okay. One final question. We have less than 5 minutes, but I'm going to throw this one in here since it's up here. What's the sentiment with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban regaining control? Are we going to end up going back? I have my own views on this.
I will tell you this. I'm not
going to share them, but we're going to ask you.
I will tell you that as a veteran, it was heartbreaking. I mean, to spend September 11th of last year and looking at a Taliban flag in Kabul was heartbreaking. Probably one of the more depressing days I've had in my life. It sucked. I don't know how to say it any better than that. It sucked so bad. I had spent many a 9/11 celebration, in Afghanistan. Probably 3 years that I was there, 2.5 years I was there, I did 3, and then I was back in there for 6 months before that, and I was actually there for a 9/11 celebration. So I did 4 9/11 celebrations in Afghanistan, in Kabul. So again, it has affected the U.S. military significantly, the veterans who serve there. It's affected their spouses and their families because, anybody who's associated knew of the war and the impact it had on families. I mean, being gone for 2.5 years, you talk about it lightly. That's 2.5 years I didn't get to see my kids. And I have 5. So it's 2.5 years that I didn't see my family. I saw them every 6 months because I got home for 2 weeks, but that's a lot different than being there all the time.
Yeah, and that's a lot of stuff that you missed everything, right? Missed soccer games and missed.
And the sentiment is that this terrorist regime is going to have to be. It's going to get removed. How? I don't know. What part is the U.S. going to play? I don't know. Politically, there doesn't seem to be an appetite. I don't care. Political spectrum. All I will say is that in my mind, both President Trump and President Biden disappointed me as a veteran with the manner in which they handled Afghanistan. Both political parties, I'm sorry, I'm disappointed with. So how are we going to, if we're going to go back in? I don't know. But I mean, Iraq, we tried to leave, and 2 years later, we're back in. So quite honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some way that we go back in when that regime starts to collapse and implodes and have to impose some sort of stability. I pray that we find another way to do it, but I'm not sure we will. We'll see.
Well, John, I can't even thank you enough for your time today and sharing your viewpoints with. I just want to offer our appreciation just as a company. This has just been so fascinating to be able to just kind of have the opportunity to just have this candid dialogue with you. I know I enjoyed it. I'm sure the Panasonic employees did, to just kind of get this pull behind the curtain and find out some of the stuff that you just definitely don't get to hear on your nightly news, and find out some of this planning that was in the background. Also, I would like to thank our company CEO, Mr. Ken Sane, for allowing Panasonic Avionics to host these live events for not only our company, but for all of the Panasonic North America companies. Again, if you're a United States veteran, please reach out to me directly, self-identify. We'd like you to become part of our community so we can engage with you in more activities like this in the future. And again, John, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. And again, think about it. What can I do in my space to be king of my kingdom, queen of my kingdom? You know what I mean? What can I do? What can I change? Can I make? It starts with you. Don't look to anyone else. And when it starts with you and you do it well, it affects others and it brings others on in. And that warmth and generosity of giving and willingness to work, that humility, that empathy will win you friendships, will win you professional relations. And you can be that leader who doesn't have to be the good person out there banging on their chest about how good they are, but as a person always putting forth those who are doing a good job, and how the team is working puts the team before self. And when you see that, that spirit will grow and will grow in your organization. Take charge of your space, make it better. If you have a toxic leader, something like that, then find a way to get around them. I've had to deal with many. It's not easy, but work your way through it. You can be in charge of who you are and who you want to be, and you can be in charge of your relationships that you have with your teammates. So take charge of that and do well at it. And that's leading from behind in my book. Thank you.
It's excellent, excellent advice. I hear the applause from the people. We were not able to see them, but I can definitely hear it.
Well,
okay,
you,
wonderful. Well, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon there on the East Coast, and we'll be in touch soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.